Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And we have actually two shows this evening. Actually, if you're on YouTube, you're going to want to jump over to Brandon Fugel at 8 o'clock. Now, it's funny, I changed the information on that, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 days ago in the platform that I use for all the streams. And it showed that it was changed there, but it was not. It was showing that it started at 6 p.m. on YouTube. So I apologize for that. Not sure how that happened. But anyway, he's coming up at 8 o'clock. And the guest I have now is a great guest that I had on previous, I don't know, a year and a half ago or so. And it's Graeme Rendall from the UK. And he's a real great UFO nuts and bolts researcher. And he is coming up on this show in just a few minutes. So a couple things. The blog this week from Charles Lear is Letters from Maury Island Principals in the 1967 Merseyside UFO Bulletin. So check that out on podcastufo.com. And I do want to thank all the supporters. I want to thank all the listeners as well. Anyone can help us out. We have to pay for certain things like graphics and blogs and things like that. So anyone can help us out at Patreon, and that link is over on our website, podcastufo.com. So we're supposed to have, I've been trying to find out information. There's supposed to be a hearing tomorrow from the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, is what it's called now. Open, closed, I'm not really sure. I heard it was a public. There was going to be public testimony and et cetera. I think at least one person is giving testimony, but I can't find out any information about that. Maybe if you were going along here and someone in chat can enlighten me a little more on that, that would be great. So anyway, it will be another interesting time. I do believe that our government is appearing to take this subject seriously, and I hope they are. And so I think I'm going to move ahead and just remember that this show is going to go to about 7:50 or so p.m. Eastern time, and then we're jumping over to Brandon Fugel, the other show, at 8 o'clock sharp over there. So join us over there after this one, if you would. If you're listening to the audio, you'll get both of these in the audio podcast, so you can listen to them on any type of media that you listen to our show on. And Graeme, welcome to the show.
Hello, Martin. Thanks for inviting me back. It's great to be back.
Yes, and I think it's is it midnight there? It's midnight.
It's just gone midnight in the UK. So
yeah.
Fresh as a daisy.
Well, I remember last time I had you on, I was like really impressed. So I'm really glad to have you back on again. And the people that are watching this live, they're going to wonder what they're looking at in your background. So it's a book cover.
It is, yeah. It's part of the cover of the new book, Intercept and Identify: Aerial Encounters, 1953 and 1954. So that's the latest in a series of books that I've written about pilot and aircrew encounters of UFOs since basically the early 1940s.
And what is this particular image of? What is that encounter?
So this is from October 1954, and it's a Gloucester Meteor pilot, so it's an RAF pilot who encountered this particular object over the south of England on a training flight.
And was it caught on any type of radar or anything like that?
Not this particular case. The pilot, he's the only one that actually saw it, and he came back to base. He reported it. He reported it to the squadron's intelligence officer, who later on, a few years down the line, actually became one of the editors of Flying Saucer Review in the UK, the UFO magazine. So it was quite strange actually how that linked up. And if that a person hadn't been, hadn't become an editor of Flying Saucer Review, then that case may never have come to light, because he was the one that kind of pushed it, if you like, and printed details of it. So this was back in a time when the RAF were clamping down on pilots talking about their UFO sightings. They were told not to talk to the press about this sort of time, 1954. Beforehand, there'd been a few who had actually managed to have interviews with the media, with the BBC, and with other on film newsreels. But At one particular time, the RAF and the Ministry of Defence decided to clamp down on these releases of information, so everything had to go through more official channels. And of course, when the press asked about these kind of things, then they just got denials. Obviously, as we know and love, that's the kind of the story that went through the 1950s and 1960s and onwards. That just all these categoric denials that anything was actually happening.
I wonder how many things we missed because of that.
Oh, there'd be lots of stories that went unreported. If you look at the kind of the stigma that started, not just in Britain, but also in the United States, there's a story in Flying Saucer Fever. That's the previous book to this one that deals with 50 to 52 cases of Edward Ruppelt, who was the first director of Blue Book. And he was on a flight that had a layover for a couple of hours at Chicago, I believe. And he got talking to the crew of the aircraft that he was flying on. It was a scheduled airliner. And they saw his Air Force uniform, and he was asking them about UFOs. And they were initially dismissive, but then when they found out he was actually, the head of the investigation project, then they warmed to him, and they actually got it was an impromptu group, a meeting that was arranged in a coffee shop nearby, and there was various pilots from different airlines turned up and had a chat with Ruppelt. But they were saying to him then that because of the stigma and they just weren't going to report these cases. So you take it from there, and also the military side of things, where if somebody reports something and then they're told afterwards, well, it's Venus or it's a weather balloon, then they're not going to report it again, are they? Or if their squadron mates see this kind of thing happening, then why would you cause yourself so much hassle? You just keep quiet about what you saw, and that's really what happened. So there's countless numbers of cases which will have gone unreported, and people have just kept quiet about them over the years, and especially back then.
Well, it's in every aspect, not just the military, where people have for years, felt threatened, or they didn't want to be called a nutcase.
Yep.
So we're at a time now where I believe that people aren't so afraid of the ridicule factor anymore. And I think it's a really good time. So anyway, if you would, can you, for the person that has never heard you before, can you give a little bit about your background and what got you interested in the UFO topic to begin with?
Yeah, so I suppose if I go even further back than that, I was interested in aircraft from a really early age. I'm talking about the age of 4, when I was given model aircraft kits to basically keep me quiet as a rather precocious kid who was into everything. I was a typical nerdy kid. If I was interested in something, I wanted to know everything about it. So I learned a lot about aircraft just by getting books from the library and getting books for my birthday and all the rest of it. But I was also interested in science fiction from an early age, and I was an early reader, and I was reading things like Isaac Asimov books, novels, when I was 8 and 9 years old. And of course, they had nice pictures of artwork on the front of spacecraft. And all this kind of stuff. And my mother, bless her, she bought me a book that she thought was one of these books, one of these science fiction novels. But it turned out to be a book about UFOs because it had a picture of a flying saucer on the front. And that got me hooked on this particular subject. So I was about 8 or 9 when that happened. And of course, the similar sort of things happened again. Read everything I could from the local library. When I exhausted that particular stock of books, then it was a city library. And so there was more books there, and I was getting books for my birthday, etc. And it just went from there. But of course, this was in the late 1970s. So, you're talking way before the internet age. And therefore, for somebody who's like sort of that kind of age, you have limited opportunities to be able to get into the subject beyond reading what you have in your local library. I didn't know about UFO newsletters in the United States. There were, I didn't know how to even approach the people who ran them in the UK. So it was quite limited until much later on that I managed to start doing a bit more about the hobby, which I had back then of UFOs, and turned it into, well, not quite a career, but a writing career. So I write books about them now, and that's only much more recently that I've managed to do that. But when I came on the show last, it was December 2021 to speak to you about the Foo Fighters. That was when the 3 interests that I really had, of long-standing interests that I've had, came together. So that's aircraft, World War II secret weapons, the German secret weapons, and UFOs, and that came together with the Foo Fighters.
Wow. And the Foo Fighters, I think it's such a fascinating thing. And I have a lot of new people. They were back in 1945, right? Or 46. I get them confused. I know the Ghost Rockets in
The
Europe
Ghost
were
Rockets were 46.
Yeah. But they were during World War II. But when was the first Foo Fighter reported that you know of?
Well, if you're actually talking about Foo Fighters per se, as in that particular phenomenon, then the first reports were in about September 1944. The legend suggests that it was November 44, but actually it's much earlier. It's like several months earlier that the Americans start seeing things at night over Western Europe. But actually, if you're looking at UFOs just generally in World War II, then there are reports from as early as sort of May 1940 in the book that I wrote. But since then, I've been researching for maybe a follow-up to that book, and I'm finding things from RAF intelligence documents which suggest that there were things going on as early as March 1940, which is really early in the war. And this is even before the bombing campaign got going in earnest. They're being RAF bombers are being followed by strange lights in the skies over Germany and over France. So things are really strange, and they don't get a grip on what's happening. The intelligence people are just completely dumbfounded, and they have no clue after months and months and even years of analysis, and they're just none the wiser. They think they're German aircraft, but they're not. Because they don't try and shoot the bombers down. They just follow them, sometimes for hundreds of miles at a time. So it's really weird. And I'm still going through the intelligence files that I managed to find in the archives. But this is a case of, people haven't done this before. But it's maybe just a case of also that people didn't know where some of these documents were. And I've stumbled across a lot of them. So yeah, it's interesting work, but it's also painstaking work, and it's going to take me a while to get through everything.
Okay, so someone just gave me this information. Thank you, Wyatt. Hello, Martin. The hearing tomorrow will be first held behind closed doors, and then the public hearing will start. So I'm going to try to follow that, and I suggest anyone else interested in this topic may try to follow that. If you can find the links online on how to actually watch that live. I'm sure there'll be some, once it's public, it should be live, I would think. We'll see. It'll be interesting anyway. And this just came about, it's like, if I don't even know if I could attend anything like that as if I wasn't a journalist, but it seems like if it's a public hearing that we'd be able to show up there. But I mean, it's funny. It's like all of a sudden, I think it was Wednesday of last week. Hey, there's going to be a hearing on the 19th. And yeah, it happened fast.
It's been building for a while. I mean, there's been talk of it happening, and then the date came out of the blue a little while ago, and then the news that it was going to be, as your correspondent there says, it was going to be a closed hearing to start with and an open hearing afterwards. And apparently, that's not necessarily unusual. It just seems a bit strange. But I'm not that kind of versed on American politics, so I'm not sure how kind of significant that is and what the ramifications are. But I'm sure it'll be all discussed to death afterwards, and I'll certainly be watching it live as well from here in the UK.
Well, you're much better off not getting involved in American politics. Anyway, so here's a question up here from Christopher. Are there surviving records of reports of Foo Fighters by German pilots?
Oh, Christopher, there's a good question. Every time that you see people commentating on the Foo Fighters, there's always this kind of statement of, well, the Germans saw them as well. Now, that's all very well to say, but proving it is a different thing entirely. There are anecdotal stories about German pilots who say they saw things, but there's no records that I know of. But somebody might come along and say, "Oh, here's a document that proves you otherwise. You're wrong, Graeme." But I've never seen a document that actually translated says that here the Germans are saying that they saw something, they saw something strange. But there are stories, certainly, and I do cover those in the book that I wrote called UFOs Before Roswell. And there's about maybe a half a dozen to a dozen stories at different times during the war of German pilots saying they saw strange things. But there's no documentation to go with them, unlike the RAF side and unlike the US Army Air Force side. So it's a different thing entirely. There's also stories about prisoners of war German prisoners of war, pilots who were taken prisoner, who were telling their captors about things like this. But again, it's actually trying to get those details in some kind of documentation form rather than just kind of word of mouth. Because we've all heard stories about certain things are happening, but until you actually get documents to prove it, then they are only stories.
That's true. Yeah, I mean that's I really appreciate your work because that's what you are looking for, and you wouldn't put it out there unless you had that information. So
I think I do try to discriminate between the two things. I'll certainly include stories like that if they're germane to the thing I'm writing about. But I'll try and discriminate between the fact that this is somebody just like coming up with a story or it's hearsay, and then this one's actually backed up by documents, and I'll point to where those documents exist, so that people can do their own homework if they're like. They can look to see where I've got that information from. But more importantly, Martin, they can see what the context of that information, where it lies. So it's not just me cherry picking certain words and certain phrases to try and kind of justify a narrative, because I don't really have a narrative in the books. I'm not one who says, look, I know what these things are. This is why. I'll just say, look, this is what happened at the time. This is what was reported. The reader makes their own mind up as to what I'm talking about. And I think that's a much more fairer way of doing it, because I really, at the end of the day, have as much clue or less clue than everybody else as to what's happening, and I'm not afraid to say that.
Yeah, I say that often in the show. It's almost like I almost seem to know less than I did when I started. But anyway, it's such a curious topic, and I don't ever see that myself getting tired of this topic. And,
me neither.
Yeah. So I'm going to just talk quickly about your books: UFOs Before Roswell, Dawn of the Flying Saucers, and let's see, Aerial and UFO and Official Investigations in 1946 through 1949, and then Flying Saucer Fever, Aerial Encounters between 1950, 1952, Intercept and Identify, Aerial Encounters 1953 through 1954. Of all those books that you wrote in those time spans between each of them, what would you say that the 1950, 1952 was the most active when it comes to at least United States encounters? Or
I think things were building up really. It was almost like a kind of pressure cooker that was going to explode, and that kind of situation almost arose in those 2 weekends in July 1952 when the U.S. Capitol was, I suppose the words, besieged by UFOs.
Right.
And of course, the air defenses didn't have a response to that. They were sending aircraft up and the things were disappearing. And then as soon as the aircraft were low on fuel and had to return to base, then they were back again. And it showed the kind of inadequacy of American air defenses. I mean, that had already been proved just by, if you go through the cases that had happened in the late 1940s and 1951, 1952, there was no kind of adequate response that the American interceptor fleets could do with these things that were being reported. But that was kind of writ large over Washington, D.C., because, you've got your nation's capital, the seat of democracy, and these things are flying over. They can do what they like, and your air force are basically powerless to stop them. Things came to a head, didn't they? And the numbers of cases were like multiplying, if you like. Now, I'm sure some cases were copycats, and people were trying to get onto a bandwagon and try and get their names in the papers and all this kind of thing. Bearing in mind, I'm looking at aerial cases, but I'm ignoring the people on the ground who were seeing things up in the sky. But there were still thousands and thousands of sightings, and yet people were. Some people would have probably just trying to jump on a bandwagon. But when you actually boil the aerial sightings down, you've got professional pilots, airline pilots and crews seeing things, and they're effectively beyond reproach. You've got military aviators who are highly trained, professional pilots, but also they're trained observers. Looking out for things which are out of the ordinary, and because their lives could depend on it sometime, and they're reporting these things as well. And those numbers of cases are just going up and up until that weekend. But then, of course, you have this press conference that is hastily convened just after those weekends,
right?
And you've got high-ranking U.S. Air Force A general comes up and he's high up in intelligence, in air intelligence, and they're trying to put the lid on it. And they're trying to dampen it all down, and they're trying to say that what was seen over Washington were radar, temperature inversions, which were causing false radar echoes, and that doesn't quite wash with the radar expert who's giving testimony at the press conference as well. But the press basically lap it up and they accept it. Because it's coming from some high-ranking officer,
yes,
and they go away. So that kind of does diffuse things a bit. But even so, the numbers of cases still get reported. It's not as if it just quietly, sort of dies off and people stop reporting them. In the years afterwards, you still get lots of reports again from professional, from aviators. So
I want to talk. I think it was. I want to say Sanderson was, but I can't remember who it was. The high-ranking officer you mentioned. But anyway,
Sanford.
I'd like to. What was it? Sanders?
Sanford.
Oh, Sanford. That's right. Okay, I want to kind of kill a myth here, because I get a lot of people saying, well, what about these UFOs over Washington? And what this is, a lot of people have seen this picture, and I'm going to put it in the show notes too, but you're seeing it live on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook right now. And that is that picture that you see when everyone shows Washington, D.C., July 12th, 1952, UFO sightings over the Capitol. That is reflections of the lights in the camera. The reflections of the lights, they totally match up with the lights below in the street lamps. And it's just it was an anomaly in the camera, and everyone thinks those are the UFOs. That those are not the UFOs, just to let you know. So anyway, and there are all types of camera anomalies that people do think are UFOs. There's a famous one in a diner, and it's the reflection of overhead lights on the window, and that, yeah. But anyway, that's an interesting time span. So what do you, of all the books that you have written, I'm just going to pop them up here. This is behind you right now. That's 1953 to 1954. And this one is 1946, is it, to 1949?
That's right.
And this one is one I had up before, 1950 to 1952. What was your favorite book to write in all those?
Oh, they all have their moments. So the process of writing them is the same each time. It's a kind of voyage of discovery. I guess people who have looked at the historical record, they know about certain cases. So you know about the Thomas Mantell case, you know about maybe the George Gorman case. These are late 40s cases. But then you'll have other ones where you'll be aware of them in terms of maybe the location and maybe a rough date, but you might not know much about what happened. And then there'll be other ones which are just completely new. And that happened to me as well when I was researching these and when I was looking for the intelligence information and the other documents associated with the case to write about them. So it was really good for me, a process of writing about things which I knew I had some information on, and I was aware of other cases, but some were just completely, this is just so exciting, learning about things for the first time. So each of those books had that particular kind of, thing to them. But I guess in terms of maybe the writing, the one I'm most kind of proud of, it would be the first one, Dawn of the Flying Saucers, in terms of chronological order, because that's the dawn of this kind of modern day phenomenon that we're all interested in. It's not necessarily the first UFOs, but it's the ones that kind of break through into the kind of public psyche, in so much as it becomes a phenomenon that everybody starts talking about. So, and it's these really early cases, and the ones like the Thomas Mantell case, the George Gorman case, the Charles Whitehead case from back then. These are all pilot encounters. They're all really, really interesting. People know about Thomas Mantell, about how he allegedly chased Venus or a balloon to his death, but also you've got George Gorman, who had a dogfight with a light over Fargo in North Dakota one night, and this thing, and effectively that could well be, if that had been a few years earlier, that would have been classed as a Foo Fighter. So, and yet they were trying to put that off as being some kind of maybe a military aircraft that had come over from Canada, and was just sort of playing tag with the Gorman's F-51 Mustang. Well, that didn't happen. but that's a story that was almost concocted as a possible explanation at the time. Of course, it was dismissed soon afterwards. But and then I think another thing they said, oh well, it would be a weather balloon. That was another suggestion. So what was he chasing? A weather balloon that was making head-on passes at his aircraft. So it just doesn't add up.
And there was speculation that he went higher than his oxygen level.
Talk Mantell here, yeah.
Yes,
well,
Mantell.
Thomas Mantell, yeah. There is speculation, but even then, when you look at the testimony from the surviving pilots, it doesn't quite add up. There are some sort of discrepancies, and I cover these in the book. That in so much as one of the pilots was having trouble at 12,500 feet. Now, anoxia is quite a thing in terms of pilots getting oxygen deprivation, and it can come on really suddenly. And if somebody's having trouble at 12,500, and then the records they said they went up to 20,000 feet or just below that, then there's little chance that a pilot struggling at much lower down would be able to get up to an altitude like that without a serious things happening, let alone Thomas Mantell climbing even higher up in afterwards after a UFO. So there's parts of that story that don't quite add up. And if people do look at the book, Dawn of the Flying Saucers, you'll see it all laid out blow by blow, and you'll see the testimony from the surviving pilots, and you can see where it doesn't quite sort of add up entirely. So there's something going on there that doesn't quite sort of tally too much. Now, that's not necessarily proof of UFO involvement, but it just shows that the story isn't exactly what everybody sort of suggests it is.
And your book, that's 1946 through, is it 1949, I believe? I'm sure Roswell's in there, but is it or is it not?
Well, it's mentioned. It's not an aerial case because obviously that wasn't a pilot and aircrew encounter. Yes. You see, it was it was a crash on the ground.
Yeah.
But the way that I kind of address Roswell, and it's an outlier to me because I struggled to try and fit it into everything else that was going on then. I'm not suggesting that Roswell didn't happen. It's just when you look at the intelligence documents and you look at everything else that was going on, you just wonder how it all fits in with the creation of Project Sign. Now, I'm not necessarily a conspiracy theorist, but I understand that some people suggest that there was a cover-up going on behind the scenes. But it's just one of those things that I have to deal with kind of facts as I see them, and I try to put things through in a fairly straightforward way, and I don't go too far down the kind of rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. And in the introduction to the book and in the epilogue, I do touch on Roswell, but I basically hold my hands up and say, where does this all fit in? I don't understand. So hopefully better minds than mine will come along and explain that someday. And hopefully we might get a resolution to Roswell in the future. But then again, we might not, because unfortunately, pretty much everybody who was associated with the actual incident now is dead.
Yeah.
So in terms of eyewitnesses, so it might be one of those things that just becomes a kind of urban legend, if you like, and everybody thinks that something happened there, but proving it's a completely different matter, unfortunately.
I wonder what would have happened if Stanton Friedman didn't stumble across. It all happened, I believe he told me, when someone didn't show up for an interview or something. And when he was at a radio station and they said, oh, you got to talk to this guy over in Houma.
That's right.
He claims he saw a UFO. If that didn't happen that day, I wonder what Roswell would be today.
Yeah, there's a lot of ifs, isn't there? It might have come out later on in a different way, or it just may have not have. And yet there's so many people associated with it. It just took that kind of thing to break the ice, didn't it? And then everybody else came out of the woodwork and say, oh yeah, I was part of that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very interesting case, but it has, like you said, it can morph into. I'm always kind of worried about things morphing into far away from the truths and the facts. That's how things can seem to go into like their own. Like something, if it's in print, people think it's real. That type of situation.
That's why I'm really careful not to kind of speculate too much about the origin of these things that are being reported. I mean, I've read books in the past where people have sort of try to come up with a kind of agenda or a narrative, and then you'll see that they try to dance on the head of a pin to try and make facts suit what they're writing about.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
we've all seen books like that, you know, over the decades.
Yeah.
But you know, when I first like embarked on writing these books, I was determined not to do that, because the last thing I want is people going away thinking, oh yeah, he's just trying to sell something. He's trying to sell a story. He's trying to sell an idea he's got in his head, and that's the last thing from my mind. I'm basically putting down, you know, what in detail. I guess when I looked at these books, some of these books in the 70s, you would see these write-ups of some of the cases that I've covered, but there would only be a paragraph. And me being this kind of sponge back then, I was always desperate for more information about these cases. I wanted to know more rather than just, you know, 2 or 3 or 6 or 7 lines about a case. And this is when I wrote these books. I thought, look, I'm trying to kind of throw everything I can in terms of particular cases at the reader, so they've got more information, they know what to do with. But at least then you can make a much more informed kind of opinion as to what a case, you know, what it represents, rather than just a few lines on a page of a book.
Right now, I've been reading a manuscript from Chris Stiles about the Shelburne 1960 incident and Shag Harbor, how they both they mingled together. So, and I even had Chris on my show. I'm going to be writing a foreword for the book, but I even had Chris on the show where I said to him, well, didn't people see like 2 crafts down and one was in danger? He goes, no, that's Shelburne. Well, you know, I mean, they're just mixed in together.
Things
and
get
one
blurred,
happened in 1960 and one happened in 1967. But yeah, I mean, it's when someone goes like on TV or whatever and they mix them together, it's so hard to undo it, you know. So those years are very interesting, from 1946 to 1949 as well. And what are some of the cases that stand out, if you can recall? I know you have three sections, 3 books. It might be hard to pull one out of a hat, but what can you recall that's an interesting case in that book?
Well, I mean, I've mentioned the George Gorman case there, so that was 1948. I'll go through a couple of others really. You talk about you're talking about the modern day phenomenon. You talk about the tic tac. Now let's go back to February 1949, and there was a training aircraft. It was an AT-11 Kansas. This was like a navigation trainer, and there was a crew on board this aircraft, and they saw something that they declared was actually sausage shaped. The forward and the trailing ends looked like a B-29 nose, so it was a kind of like a cucumber shape, I guess. Now that could be could have been interpreted as a tic tac. That's almost your classic cigar shape kind of thing. That was a phrase that was used probably through the 60s and 70s, wasn't it? I remember that from books I used to read back then as well, of descriptions of objects, and that now I suppose they call them tic tacs. So there's a case from back then that resonates today. And then you've got, well, this comes from Flying Saucer Fever, this particular one, and we're looking at the Yellow Sea, which is off China, isn't it? And this is in about I think this is October 1951, and there's the crew of a US Navy flying boat, and they see this thing. Well, first of all, that one of the gunners sees it, and then it's picked up on radar. So this is a radar visual case, and it looks almost like a MiG-15 fighter without the tail and without the cockpit. And they've actually got a drawing of it in the Blue Book files, but it obviously comes from Grudge, because it took place before Blue Book was actually set up in March 1952. And then the intelligence people are trying their damnedest to try and reconcile this strange craft with a MiG-15, to try and say, well, look, it's a MiG, it's a Russian fighter, even though the way it was seen would be almost beyond a Russian pilot being able to fly one of these fighters. Bear in mind, they had a very small fuel load back in those days to get to where it was and get back home safely. But you can see why they're trying to say, oh, it's just a Russian fighter. So that was an interesting case as well. That this strange-looking tailless craft with these short, stubby wings and this huge plume of orange, red, and white flames coming out the back of it. And the intelligence people are just trying to say, oh, yeah, you just saw a Russian aircraft. But that's quite a detailed case as well. And that was quite interesting. And actually on the cover of Flying Saucer Fever, for people who have seen the cover, there's a picture of a B-36 Peacemaker, which was a huge 6-propeller, 4-jet-engined nuclear capable bomber. It's a huge aircraft. I think it had like 15 crew members on board, and this aircraft was being watched from the ground, flying over an airfield in the south of America. And as they looked at it from the ground, there was one UFO near it, but also another one which appeared to be in between the tail of the aircraft and the trailing edge of the wing. So it was nestled in between, right next to the airplane.
Jeez.
And of the intelligence file to do with the case, so the investigation, the actual bit that's available publicly is only a very small proportion of the overall case. And the intelligence officer who actually was on the ground, he was one of the witnesses. He was also the person who actually had to come up with this file to pass it on to Blue Book. And he reckoned it was one of the biggest kind of case files that was ever dreamt up in terms of what was sent out, and it was something like 70 odd pages, and yet only a few of the pages actually remain. So you just have to wonder what was in the rest of the pages. You would love to see the crew kind of reports they saw from the aeroplane, because they were right next to this thing, whereas they don't appear. It's only the ground witnesses actually appear in the intelligence files, which is a real shame. So you just have to wonder, what's going on there. So that's an interesting case as well. And then, of course, also the cover, which we talked about earlier, about the Gloucester Meteor pilot, that's on the front of the cover of Intercept and Identify, which is the 1953 and 1954 cases. But also in that book, Kelly Johnson, who was the chief engineer of Lockheed, he turns out that he saw one from his ranch, but it's also in conjunction with a US Navy Constellation aircraft that was up in the air at the time, and the crew on board that saw the same thing. So you've got these kind of multiple witness sightings, and that's quite an interesting case as well. So, and that happened. When did that happen? That happened in 1953. So yeah, December 1953 that happened. So yeah, there's various cases peppered through these books, which some of them people may have never come across before when they read them, but they're really interesting in their own right, and I think they deserve more of an airing that they have in the past, because a lot, as I said before, a lot of these cases I've never come across them before. They've obviously been buried away in the Blue Book files and the documentation. And if they have appeared in print before, it's only been maybe a few lines, and out of a huge book. But they deserve much more.
Do you have any idea through all these books, any verified speeds that were just non?
Oh yeah,
we couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
And what was like the highest speed of anything that you can recall right offhand?
So most of the cases, if you look at the kind of late 40s, early 1950s, the American all-weather interceptors, and I'm talking about the F-94 Starfire at this time, it was a two-seat Lockheed jet fighter, and that was the standard all-weather interceptor, and it could do about 600 miles an hour. It wasn't supersonic, but it could do about 600 knots. And these things were outpacing it, twice the speed of it. So straight away, you can tell that, and this is even faster than the fastest aircraft at the time, the record-breaking aircraft. So you can tell from then that these things were demonstrating speeds that were, unknown to humankind. They were definitely beyond what was people were capable of, whether it was American aircraft, or was Russian aircraft, or British, or wherever. And then there are other cases of things even faster. I can't give you a figure off the top of my head, particular figures, but some of them were really quick. And sometimes they say that they just disappeared off into the heavens. And sometimes they almost demonstrate fantastic rate of climb as well. In the George Gorman case from October 1948, the thing actually, the light basically just goes upwards. And he's trying to fly after it. He's climbing in his F-51 Mustang, and he gets to the point where the engine can't basically propel him upwards any further. It goes into what we call an engine stall, and he drops out of the sky, because he just can't chase after this thing. His aircraft's just not powerful enough to chase after it.
Yeah. I bring that up a lot of times when you see like images, people have seen things like this, and then the characteristics of travel. And unusual maneuvers and things like that, that people have seen. And then I talk to someone and they'll say, what everybody's seeing is just military craft that we're not aware of yet. And then I kind of like, everyone forgets the history and what people have been seeing for many generations, that defy, some of them defying what we could do with the top of our technology today, that people were seeing back in the 1940s, say.
If they these things were kind of high technology aircraft that either America was inventing or the Russians were experimenting with, or some other nation around the world, then surely with that evidence of these things by now. So you can't write off the early 1950s or the late 1940s sightings as experimental aircraft, because they will be documented now. They would be in history books by now. Even if there were failures and they'd been written off, surely this information would have come out by now. You only have to look at the gestation period of the stealth, the F-117 or the B-2 stealth bomber, to know that there's a certain time lag between them being developed, built, flown, and then being publicly unveiled. Even some experimental Russian aircraft from the 50s and 60s, they might have been fairly unknown to most Western people, but the air intelligence assets in NATO and in America, they were still aware of these things years before a lot of them were unveiled publicly. So these kind of like explanations for UFOs back in the 40s and 50s simply don't wash. And you can't blame drones back then, because drones in those days were full-size aircraft practically. The drones were V1. The US Navy were experimenting with copies of the V1 flying bomb. It was called the JB-2 Loon. That was a drone. The Russians had turbojet-powered aircraft-sized drones that they were experimenting with in the early 50s. But those kind of things didn't and couldn't maneuver or go as quick as some of the things that were reported. So yes, okay, you might be able to write off certain things nowadays as drones, but certainly not back then.
That's right. And I think as we move on through our technology, it will be, tougher and tougher to figure things out. Look at Starlink for one. So many people think that's a UFO. A friend of mine contacted me. You can't believe what I saw. Out in he was in Arizona, I think, at the time. But it's just really hard to it's going to be more difficult, and CGI is going to get better, and it's going to be harder and harder to know what's real and what's not. And that's for someone just starting out.
People send me pictures and people send me video. They'll direct message me and send me things and say, Graeme, what do you think this is? I'm not a photo expert. I can't really say what they are. And really, my opinion at the end of the day is no worse, no better than anybody else's. So, it's. I don't really want to say to people, look, don't send me stuff like this because I can't really help you. But effectively, that's what it boils down to, because I'm not qualified to be able to say to somebody, yeah, that's real, or yeah, that's a forgery, or that's what that is. I simply don't know. They'd be better off sending those to people who can, look at and analyze imagery, professionally.
Right. I'm trying to. Someone asked if we discussed Cape Verde, Missouri case, and I think that was 19. Wasn't that very early on? Are you familiar with that case?
Not offhand, unless it's under a different name or something, or it's got people associated with it that I'm.
I had a granddaughter on this show that discussed that, of supposedly Reverend, or I believe that's what it was, that her grandfather was it. Anyway, it's interesting to answer Joni's question. No, it doesn't really fit into what we're discussing this evening. What are some of the really interesting European cases in any of these books that you can think of?
European cases. There's, well, the Gloucester Meteor case, the Flight Lieutenant James Saladin, the October 1954 case that you can see on the picture behind me. That's one of the classic ones from back then. There were other kind of British crews who on transatlantic flights that were seeing strange things about that time. There was a crew that were flying over Labrador. It's not quite Europe, but there were a BOAC. That's a British airline, a transatlantic airline, and they saw something that it was like seven objects, of which one of them, the biggest one, was actually changing shape. So it started off in one particular shape, and then it kind of morphed into something else. And the official explanation was that they were seeing Mars. So,
yeah, Mars morphs all the time.
Yeah, and it also has a lot of 6 other objects with it. So, how does that work?
Yeah, I love some of the explanations. It's been, the swamp gas explanations over the years, how ridiculous they can be. Venus can be tricky. I mean, because it's so bright in the sky, and people see that, and like at first you think like, what is that? That type of thing. Sometimes it could be like that.
And that's the thing, though, isn't it? It'll fool some of us some of the time. But if you're a professional, let's say an airline pilot, and you're flying, day after day, night after night on the same kind of scheduled run, because that's what they usually do. They would fly to the same cities most of the time. They would see these kind of things on a regular basis. So they would see Venus, they would see other stars, they would see they would see other aircraft in the skies, they would see strange weather. They would know if you were flying long enough, even if you were flying transatlantic or you were flying over America or wherever, you'd recognize these things for what they were after a certain period of time. If you were a new crew or you were a new pilot, then fair enough. But if you'd had hundreds or thousands of hours under your belt, then you would know what you were looking at. And also, more importantly, you would know what you'd seen for the first time, and it was something out of the ordinary. And these were the pilots who were coming forwards and saying, look, this is not what you're saying it is. This is something different. And yet they were still being written off as, Venus, swamp gases later on, weather balloons, other aircraft, cockpit reflections, all these kind of things were being trotted out to explain things which, when you look at the testimony and you look at the information that were passed to the intelligence officers to be passed up to Blue Book and the other, and Sign and Grudge, etc., that they just don't, it just doesn't stack up, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It's kind of an insult to people that have, they take a chance and come forward and talk about what they've seen. And then, they're kind of insulted by saying, no, you saw Venus, that's all it was. Is, well, I didn't know Venus could, do right angle turns at 2,000 miles an hour, that type of thing. It's like, and I think it's just getting that, I don't know, you want to call it debunking or whatever it is, getting that word out there and getting it in print and whatever it is, and kind of deflates anyone's testimony.
Yeah, it's just basically just keeping a lid on the situation and just trying to diffuse it and just diminish its importance. And just say, look, nothing to see here, move on. And that's all it was, I guess.
Yeah,
and they couldn't explain it themselves, so just say, oh yeah, you're just saying things.
Yeah, and how much have you had to drink and all that type of thing?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Graeme, where can someone get a hold of you? I know you're on Twitter a lot.
So at Border 750 is my Twitter handle. If you look for me on Amazon, if you just put my name into an Amazon search engine, then you'll see the book titles come up that way. That's the easiest way. But if you look at my bio on Twitter, you'll find my website there as well. So it's easier just to go that way.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I hope to have you back on again. You're always really a great guest.
Oh, thank you.
It's really enjoyable. And I called you. I'm going to embarrass you. I called you the Dave Marler of the UK.
I wouldn't label myself in the same universe as Dave Marler. He's alone to himself. He's a great guy, and he's got a great thing going with this new initiative that he's got to digitize.
I know. It's pretty exciting.
All the documentation. Yeah.
That's great.
Worth supporting that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. You take care.
Yeah. Cheers, Martin. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye now. All right, everyone. So why don't you jump over to our other stream? We have Brandon Fugel coming on in a couple of minutes. And for those of you just listening to this, thank you, and keep your eyes to the sky.